Welcome and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Kubiak. I'm a professor of practice at ASU, where I serve as the director of future security education in ASU's Future Security Initiative. The educational offerings I help guide include the MA in Global Security, the MAGS, which also has a non-technical concentration in cybersecurity and a brand new concentration in irregular warfare. We also offer a graduate certificate in global security and competitive statecraft, and are building a new portfolio of short courses on similar topics to be offered in ASU's career and professional development educational outlet, Career Catalyst. Today's event is one in a series of events we run each fall and spring semesters to highlight the thought-leading security practitioner faculty that teach in our programs. Tonight's speaker is Professor Tom Just. Tom is assistant teaching professor in the Future Security Initiative in the School of Politics and Global Studies. He teaches courses in the MA in Global Security on domestic politics and security, post-conflict governance, and comparative study of conflict, among others. Prior to coming to ASU, Tom was the inaugural postdoctoral fellow with the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University and taught a variety of international affairs courses as a lecturer at the University of Georgia. His research focuses on the use of, the research focuses on the use of legal and public diplomacy strategies to counter extremist ideologies and work toward reconciliation in societies that have endured traumatic events such as genocide. This research earned him the award of Young Ambassador for Peace and Reconciliation from UNESCO. Tom also has professional experience serving as a congressional aide in Washington, D.C., and having served as the assistant to the director of African and Middle Eastern Affairs within Poland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Tonight, he's here to talk about his new book, Combating Antisemitism in Germany and Poland, Strategies since 1990, and maybe discuss some insights for today. This is Tom's first stop on what was going to be a book tour for his new book, I assume. So Professor Just will start with about 40 minutes of discussion about the book, and then we'll open it up to questions. Please feel free at any time to submit your question through the Q&A block, and I'll try to get to them appropriately answered when the time permits. Professor Just, thank you for coming today. Sir, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Jeff. And let me just share my slides. So welcome, everyone. As you can see, the title of my talk today is Combating the Rise of Antisemitism in Europe and the US. And I'll just start by talking a bit about how I got interested in the topic. So back in 2010, as Jeff mentioned, I did an internship with Poland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as part of that, my supervisor was actually the special envoy to the Jewish diaspora, which was a position that I had no idea existed at the time. But I got to learn firsthand about a lot of the initiatives that Poland has put into place with regard to countering anti-Semitism and reaching out to Jewish communities, both inside the country and abroad. I've done some similar work and research in Germany as well, which is what gave me the idea for the book that I have that just came out this past week. So starting off with a brief outline of the presentation. So first, we'll work to define the term anti-Semitism, which is more complex than I think a lot of people realize. There's no universal definition for what anti-Semitism is. Then we'll look at the two countries that I examined in my research, so Germany and Poland, and the problem both historically as well as in more modern times. Then we'll examine some of the strategies that have been employed to counter the problem and conclude by evaluating the effectiveness of those strategies and also looking at some of the new challenges that have arisen in recent years. So the research question that I set out with at the beginning of this project is, have measures taken to reduce anti-Semitic attitudes and incidents been successful in Germany and Poland since 1990? So these initiatives have been in place for some time, but to this point, nobody's actually really evaluated whether or not they've been working. So that's what I decided to do through this project. And I focus on the period since 1990 because that's roughly the end of the Cold War, and also when these countries started to put into place some of these strategies. All right, so as I mentioned, these strategies are relatively recent. So most have been implemented in the last 30 years or so, which gives us a big enough sample size where we can actually start evaluating whether or not they've been working. The next point, so anti-Semitism is a unique issue in both law and public diplomacy. And I use the term public diplomacy a bit differently than some of you may be familiar with, and I'll get into that a bit later in the presentation. Also, anti-Semitism is both a domestic and an international problem. So it's a domestic problem in that it can foment extremism within a country. It can also spread internationally. But for these two countries in particular, There are a lot of international perceptions about them given the legacy of the Holocaust and the fact that these were the two primary locations of where the Holocaust took place. So they had an increased motivation to address this issue. And then finally, I think the concepts that we'll talk about here are things that can apply to other regions that have endured ethnic and religious tensions. So we can get into that a bit more later in the presentation and then during the Q&A. All right, so in terms of defining anti-Semitism, as I mentioned, there's no universal definition for the term. You may have heard differing definitions from different organizations, but one of the flaws that I've seen in these is that they often allude to manifestations of anti-Semitism, but don't explicitly state what those are. So that's what I tried to do here. And I developed the definition that you see in this slide, which is hostile attitudes or attacks targeting Jewish people, symbols, or interests based on religious, economic, racial, or political grounds. And I use those four adjectives because those are what I find to be the four primary manifestations of anti-Semitism. So let's take a look at each of those four. So first we have religious anti-Semitism, which is the oldest manifestation and dates all the way back to antiquity. And this stems from the perceived refusal of Jews to adopt majority religious and social customs. And later, as Christianity developed, this came to include things such as deicide, so the belief that Jews are responsible for the killing of Christ, and also blood libel, which stems from the Middle Ages, and is the belief that Jews will kidnap Christian children and use their blood in religious ceremonies. Now, there's still a surprising number of people who believe this, and we've seen this embedded in some more contemporary conspiracy theories such as QAnon. So you'll often hear about this cabal of elites who are drinking the blood of children. That's where this comes from. Next, we have economic anti-Semitism, and this is also stemming from the Middle Ages, and this involves stereotypes of Jews as being greedy, dishonest, and wealthy, and importantly, exploiting Christian debtors. Because during this time period in the Middle Ages, Christianity had a prohibition on what's called usury, so charging interest on loans. And because of this, there were a lot of non-Christians working in those occupations, which most Christians across Europe were fine with because they believed that Jews specifically were damned. So that became an important manifestation of anti-Semitism during that time and has evolved since. Next, we have racial anti-Semitism, which is basically a combination of ethnic nationalism and pseudosciences such as eugenics. So this is where you get things like Nazi racial science from. And the belief here is that Jewish blood and not only beliefs are inferior. And I find this to be the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism because somebody can't simply convert to another religion to avoid persecution. They are who they are. And because of that, this racial component is what often has led toward genocide, and especially during the Holocaust. And finally, we have political anti-Semitism, which is the belief that Jews seek illegitimate political control. And this can involve things like Holocaust denial and Zionist conspiracy theories. And when I say Holocaust denial, that's not necessarily just saying that the Holocaust didn't happen. This can also be statements such as that the numbers are inflated or that Jews were complicit in perpetrating the Holocaust in order to pursue Zionist objectives. So Holocaust denial is not just one thing. There are many different forms of that as well. All right, now we'll look at some factors that are unique to the German case. So the first is the role of Martin Luther. So Martin Luther, the Christian theologian, he had a number of anti-Semitic writings during his lifetime, the most notable of which was entitled On the Jews and Their Lies, where he called on followers to burn synagogues and said that Jews are full of devil's feces. And these writings were later invoked by the Nazis as well and have been used to stoke religious anti-Semitism over time. And in fact, the Nazis passed out copies of On the Jews and Their Lies at the Nuremberg rallies. The modern Lutheran Church has distanced themselves from those writings, but nonetheless, they have been used by anti-Semites to stoke this form of religious anti-Semitism. The next point, so the stab in the back legend is something that arose during the interwar period. So after World War I, and you can see a depiction of this on the slide of a Jewish hand stabbing a German soldier in the back. And this is something that fueled interwar anti-Semitism in that Jews were scapegoated for Germany's loss in the First World War. An interesting fact, however, is that German Jews actually served in the German military as a larger percentage of the population than any other group. So I think it's interesting that they are scapegoated for that loss. The next point is the folkish, what are known as folkish ideas of nation and race. So this is where slogans such as blood and soil come from, and the belief that certain ethnicities are inherent to specific lands. And this is something that's fueled racial anti-Semitism in the country. Along with that, defining Judaism as a race is something that was a major contributor to the Holocaust, as I mentioned, with regard to racial anti-Semitism. And then finally, a point about Germany in more modern times is that Germany is more diverse than some other countries in Europe, particularly with regard to its Muslim population, which is around 5% and growing, especially since the influx of Syrian refugees. So there are various manifestations of anti-Semitism in Germany, and it's a bit different within Christian and Muslim communities. All right, now some factors that are unique to the Polish case. So Poland initially had been more tolerant than most of Europe with regard to Jews and religion in general, which is why Jews fled persecution in other parts of Europe and found refuge in Poland. And because of this, Jews were integral in developing the early Polish economy. Jews, in fact, have been on Polish lands as long as Christians have, over 1,000 years. So around the 10th century, there were Jews, particularly in Western Europe, who were fleeing to Poland to seek refuge there where it was more tolerant. At the same time, you had the Polish king at the time convert to Catholicism in an attempt to avoid an invasion by the Saxons who were threatening to convert all the pagan Poles at the time. So Judaism and Christianity have been on Polish lands for the same length of time, but this competition in the Polish economy is something that's led toward grievances over time. As I mentioned, this idea of Jews exploiting Christians, particularly in the finance industry. The next point, so is Catholicism has become identified with Polish identity. This is something that has led toward religious anti-Semitism in the country. This is particularly true during the interwar period. So after World War I, when Poland finally became an independent state, there was a push within the country by some to create a Catholic state. And because of this, there was a rise in religious and racial anti-Semitism. Going a bit further into history, so more recently, the communist government during the Cold War would often stoke anti-Semitism as a means to subdue nationalist sentiment in the country by creating a common enemy. So they thought that by stoking anti-Semitism, they would rally Polish nationalists and the communist government together against this common enemy, which oftentimes was Jews. And another interesting point in Poland is this concept of victimhood competition, which is basically the belief that if you acknowledge the suffering of one group, you're diminishing the suffering of another. So the belief here is that if you acknowledge the suffering of Polish Jews, you're diminishing the suffering of ethnic Poles and Catholics within the country. And this is something that can also lead toward anti-Semitic attitudes. All right, now just talking about some more recent issues in these countries. So in the case of Germany, the overwhelming majority of anti-Semitic crimes have been committed by those on the far right, and I'll show some statistics on this a bit later. Over 90% of anti-Semitic crimes are committed by those from a far right ideology. And here you can see one of the major far right political parties in Germany, the NPD, the National Democratic Party, at a rally. And the NPD was founded in 1964 on a neo-Nazi ultra-nationalist ideology. There have been attempts to ban this political party for its extremism. The most notable effort was in 2003 in the German Federal Constitutional Court. This effort, however, failed, and since that time, the NPD held seats in 2 of the state parliaments in Germany. From 2004 to 2011, these states were in the former East Germany, and I actually lived in Saxony from 07 to 08, where the NPD held about 10% of the seats. You also have Die Republikaner, which was founded in 1983 by a man named Franz Schönherber, who had ties to the Nazi Party as well as the Waffen-SS. And this party was founded on a nationalist and xenophobic platform that includes such things as expelling all foreigners from German territory and also returning the country to its pre-World War II borders. It's worth noting, however, that neither of these parties have ever passed the 5% threshold to obtain seats in the Bundestag, even though they have done so in 2 of the German states in their state parliaments. But more recently, we've seen the rise of the AfD, or the Alternative for Germany, which has really consolidated the far right in Germany and has achieved more political power because of that. And you have some anti-Semitic strains within the party, even though it's seen as more mainstream than those more overtly anti-Semitic and neo-Nazi parties. So one of the founders of the AfD, Björn Höcke, was quoted in 2017 as saying, "We Germans are the only people in the world who have planted a memorial of shame in the heart of their capital," referring to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. The AfD has also exploited tensions between Muslim and Jewish migrants within Germany. So it's worth noting that the Jewish population in Germany, 90% of them have an immigrant background. So xenophobia is something that can also affect this group. But the AfD has created a group known as Jews in the AfD as a way to shield itself from anti-Semitic accusations by essentially saying that the anti-Semitism problem in Germany does not come from the far right, it's from the Islamic communities. So that's something the AfD has done to try to shield itself from those accusations. In 2017, the AfD actually became the third largest party in the German parliament, the Bundestag, obtaining about 13% of the seats. But they've been even more successful in state elections. So they've held seats, unlike the past two parties that I mentioned that only achieved seats in 2 of the states, the AfD has held seats in every one of the 16 German states. In fact, in Saxony, where they've been most successful, they nearly achieved a plurality in 2019 with just under 30% of the vote. And here you can see the rise in these far-right parties with the AfD in recent years. So this is data that shows election results from 1990 to 2021 with these 3 parties. And you can see the far-right votes increased drastically around 2013 to 2017. And with the rise of the AfD, the NPD and Republikaner never really achieved more than about 2% of the vote combined in prior years. So they never passed that 5% threshold to actually obtain seats, but the AfD has done that in recent years. And in fact, the opinion polls show that in the elections next year, they may actually increase their share. All right, and just a few other factors in the German case. So I found 2014 to be an interesting year to study because at that time we had Gaza war protests similar to how we do now. But at the rallies that we saw against the Gaza war and against Israel's actions, there was oftentimes a conglomeration of different ideologies. There were those from the far right, there were those from the far left, and there were Islamist groups as well, all marching together. And you oftentimes saw anti-Semitic slogans such as "Gas the Jews" at these rallies. Here you see a photo taken in Dresden, which says, "Yesterday Dresden, today Gaza." And this is a banner from the NPD, because on the far right, you'll oftentimes hear the claim that the firebombing of Dresden was the real Holocaust. And they're equating that today to actions in Gaza. And we've seen that anti-Semitism has become increasingly political in Germany, and will oftentimes spike with regard to events happening in and around Israel. We also have what's known as the Great Replacement theory. And here the belief is that wealthy Jews are funding migration into the West, so into Europe, into the United States, specifically Muslim refugees into Europe and Central Americans into the United States. And this is something that's actually led to terrorist attacks here in the US. So you have in 2019, the El Paso Walmart shooting, you have the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, you have the Buffalo supermarket shooting. All of these were motivated by the same anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but it's worth noting that they all attacked different groups. So in El Paso, it was Hispanics, in Pittsburgh, it was Jews, and in Buffalo, it was Black Americans. So I think it's worth noting that anti-Semitism and the threat that it poses is not just toward the Jewish community, but society at large. And the Great Replacement theory, as you can imagine, has also led to a rise in xenophobic attitudes as well. All right, now looking at the case of Poland. So here you see a photo taken from a far-right rally in Poland of a group called Falanga, which is one of the major far-right parties. And Falanga existed during the 1930s, so during the interwar period, but was revived again in the 1990s. And Falanga pushes for a Catholic state of Poland. So they have this idea of Catholic nationalism, similar to what we saw during the interwar period. And Falanga is known for co-opting events, such as the Polish Independence Day March in Warsaw, and I'll show a photo of that on the next slide. We also have a group known as the All Polish Youth, which existed during the interwar period as well, but was revived again in 1989. And this actually began as a student organization and promotes a Catholic nationalist ideology. And the All Polish Youth has advocated for boycotts of Jewish businesses, the segregation of Jews from society, similar policies to what the Nazi regime imposed in Germany. And here you see a photo from the Polish Independence Day March. Now, this march is not inherently anti-Semitic or of the far right, but it's been co-opted by these groups. So they appear in large numbers and oftentimes overtake these marches. And there's been clashes with police in recent years. So I think this is something that's also worth noting. All right. Similar to in Germany, in Poland, there are anti-Semitic strains within some of the major parties in the country. So in Poland, this is apparent with the Law and Justice Party, which until just a few months ago was the ruling party in Poland. And you had a number of anti-Semitic statements from leaders within the party. So for instance, their deputy leader and former defense minister expressed the belief on a Catholic nationalist radio station that he believed the Protocols of the Elders of Zion could be real, which is an anti-Semitic conspiracy hoax document. You also have a senator from the party stating that Polish Jews are represented by the Knesset and not the Polish parliament, playing into this dual loyalty trope. Law and Justice also passed and enacted a controversial law in 2018, which banned any discussion of the collaboration of Poles during the Holocaust. And many saw this as essentially equating those discussions to Holocaust denial. So there was a lot of backlash from the United States and Israel and other countries within the European Union. The government had to walk back the law a little bit, in that there are no longer criminal penalties, but there are still civil penalties for violating that law. All right, in terms of just summing up the Polish far-right parties, so the overtly anti-Semitic parties, like I mentioned, such as Falanga, tend to receive little support within the country. None of them have ever received more than 0.3% of the vote in elections since 1990. But we do have these anti-Semitic factions within some of the larger parties like Law and Justice, particularly those Catholic nationalist factions. Because it's not simply about creating a Catholic state, it's creating a Catholic state at the exclusion of other groups, such as Jews. Worth noting as well is that these groups from the far right oftentimes try to target the youth in order to make the movement sustainable, more appealing, and more mainstream. And they've increasingly aimed their propaganda and recruitment efforts toward women as a means to alter their image. So they'll reach out to young women, try to recruit them into the group in the belief that it softens their image and they're not seen as simply groups with young men who have shaved heads. But they also believe that attracting young women will bring young men into the group as well and make the groups more sustainable going into the future. All right, so now on to some of the strategies to counter anti-Semitism. So there are two primary strategies as part of this. The first are legal measures, and the next are public diplomacy. So legal measures include things like penalties for hate speech, incitement, and Holocaust denial, granting Judaism full legal status, and also reforming immigration policies, especially in the case of Germany, which Germany has used to help rebuild domestic Jewish communities that were lost during the Holocaust. And the public diplomacy measures, so typically when people hear the term public diplomacy, they think of simply communications with foreign publics. However, what I mean here also has a domestic engagement aspect to it, because in order to have credibility behind messages that are projected abroad, there has to be a domestic buy-in to it. And that can include things like working with NGOs to counter far-right and other anti-Semitic groups, increasing education efforts, helping integrate Jewish immigrants, especially in Germany, helping fund the preservation of Jewish cultural sites, the establishment of museums, and also focusing on common connections between the country and its Jewish history, especially in Poland, where I mentioned Christianity and Judaism arrived in Poland at around the same time, and they've both been present there for over 1,000 years. So both Christian and Jewish identities are especially important in that case. All right, now to some of the German legal measures. So Germany has placed restrictions on Nazi expression in the country, so symbols, speech, music, etc. In fact, the German police has actually created an app known as Nazi Shazam to detect far-right music at rallies, music that's banned within the country. Germany has loosened immigration restrictions, particularly on post-Soviet Jews, which has increased the Jewish population in the country from about 30,000 in 1990 to over 100,000 by 2012. It's leveled off a bit since then, largely at the request of Israel, who requested that Germany tighten some of its immigration laws because there were so many Jews who were immigrating to Germany rather than to Israel. Germany also granted Judaism full legal status, which surprisingly didn't happen until 2003. But this has enabled greater funding and resources, as well as security for synagogues. Because in Germany, oftentimes people will pay a tithe to their congregation through their taxes. So this allowed Jewish congregations to bring in that funding as well. Germany's also placed restrictions on political parties in the country that are deemed to work against the German Constitution. This is why they have the 5% threshold for seats in the Bundestag as a means to keep out more extremist elements, which tended to work with parties like the NPD, but more recently the AfD has passed that threshold. Parties can also be reviewed by the Federal Constitutional Court, but as I mentioned, that's quite rare and is also a very cumbersome process. Recently, Germany's also adapted a national strategy against anti-Semitism. So in 2018, the German government created the position of Federal Government Commissioner for Jewish Life in Germany and the fight against anti-Semitism in 2018. This position then led an effort to create a national strategy, which was adopted in fall of 2022. And some of the elements of this strategy include improving data collection on anti-Semitism, developing education efforts, fostering a culture of remembrance, establishing punishments, and providing security for anti-Semitic acts, and also bolstering Jewish life within the country. The US, in fact, adopted a similar strategy in May of 2023 that's based off of this German strategy. So I think a statistic that's worth noting is that over 60% of religiously motivated hate crimes in the US from 96 until 2022 targeted Jews. And this comes from data that's been published by the FBI, which is notable because only 2.4% of the US population are Jews. So you have 2.4% of the population who are victims of 60% of religiously motivated crime, which shows that anti-Semitism is also a major problem in the United States as well. And here you can see a photo from January of last year, where a U.S. delegation led by Doug Emhoff, who's the second gentleman, accompanied by Deborah Lipstadt, who's one of the leading scholars on anti-Semitism, met with Germany's Jewish Life Commissioner, Felix Klein, to discuss these strategies. So this was after Germany had already adopted its, and the U.S. was considering adopting one, which it then did about 4 months later. All right, now on to some of the public diplomacy initiatives in Germany. So collective guilt was a major motivator for this, because in Germany, there's a remorse for the historic crimes against humanity during the Holocaust. And these efforts were undertaken for a number of reasons, but part of it was to change perceptions of the country, to deal with collective guilt domestically, but also to address opinions from abroad about anti-Semitism in the country, and Germany wanting to show that it had progressed and reconciled with its history and the legacy of the Holocaust. In 1999, the German Foreign Ministry published a document called Conception 2000, which identified civil society's engagement as essential to these public diplomacy initiatives. And I'll just highlight one of the groups that's listed here, Exit Deutschland, which is geared toward removing people from a far-right lifestyle. So they will reach out to those who are in far-right groups, help them socially to remove themselves from those groups, which is a very difficult process because people's entire lives can be wrapped up in them. And also do things like provide security for former members who were threatened. To date, they've helped remove over 800 people from those movements with only about a 3% recidivism rate. So it's a pretty significant organization in that respect. Germany's also established things like the Jewish Museum of Berlin to commemorate Jewish culture and history within the country. They've helped to restore synagogues. The number of synagogues in the country today is nowhere near what it was in the 1930s, but it has been increasing over the last few decades. You also have organizations like the Jewish Community of Berlin, which has actually existed for about 600 years. But more recently, they have adopted initiatives to aid Jewish immigrants to the country. Because again, 90% of German Jews today have an immigrant background. So language training, job training, these sorts of things are provided by organizations like this. They also conduct outreach to outside groups and organize cultural festivals, one of the most notable being the Days of Jewish Culture. All right, so on to Poland and its legal measures. So Poland has a bit of a different approach to its legal measures. One of them is the establishment of what's known as the Institute of National Remembrance. So the Institute of National Remembrance is basically a think tank which does research and determines the facts of Nazi and communist crimes within the country, but also has prosecutorial powers to prosecute those who, for example, engage in Holocaust denial. Poland is also allowed for the repatriation of Poles to Polish territory, but their immigration laws are more restrictive than Germany's toward Jews. So that's why we haven't seen the same growth in the Jewish community in Poland that we've seen in Germany. Just a quick statistic. So prior to World War II, Poland actually had the largest Jewish community in the world at about 3.5 million. That population today is only about 3 to 10,000. So it was decimated during the Holocaust. Over 90% of Polish Jews were killed in the Holocaust. and the rest mainly fled after the war, which is why we have such a tiny community there today when, 90 years ago, it was the largest in the world. Similar to in Germany, Poland has also granted Judaism full legal status, which has also allowed for government support for Jewish institutions, such as the Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Heritage in Poland, which helps to restore synagogues and other communal property within the country. Now, the public diplomacy campaign in Poland. So this really began by correcting mischaracterizations about the country and its history. So back when Poland was trying to accede to the European Union, they conducted survey research across Europe about what other Europeans thought of Poland. The number one thing that came back was that Poles were anti-Semitic. So they wanted to change that narrative and that perception about the country. So one of the things that they would do is reach out to news outlets, for example, when inaccurate terms were used, such as the Polish death camp at Auschwitz. Those sorts of terms they would often correct, and state that they were the Nazi German concentration camp at Auschwitz, correcting some of these mischaracterizations of history. But once Poland became a member of the EU, they expanded this campaign, and they engaged in what's known as the nation branding campaign, where they tried to project an identity abroad and show a post-Cold War image of Poland. And part of this included domestic engagement, like I had mentioned. So this included things like cultural exchanges, dialogical forums, which were often geared toward discussing righteous Gentiles during the Holocaust, so Poles who helped Jews during that time, and also establishing this common identity of Poles and Jews. Poland has also put an emphasis on reviving domestic Jewish culture in the country. So in Poland, we haven't seen the rise in the domestic Jewish population as we did in Germany, but we have seen a rise in Jewish culture. So this includes things like support for Jewish festivals, community centers for the Jewish community that does reside there, as well as the establishment of museums to preserve that history. And here you can see a photo from 2007 of the Polish president at the time, Lech Kaczynski, laying the cornerstone for the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, the Poland Museum as it's known. And notably, he was a member of the Law and Justice Party, but even during that time period, the Law and Justice Party believed that it was important to reconcile with these issues. All right, so now on to how we evaluate these strategies. So there's a few measures that I use. The first is membership in far-right groups. Then we have attitudes toward Jews within these countries, the belief in anti-Semitic myths, the number of anti-Semitic crimes committed, and finally, the current state of the domestic Jewish community and their perceptions about anti-Semitism. So here you can see a graph showing the membership in German far-right groups from 91 until 2022. And this is data that's published by the Federal Office for Protection of the Constitution in Germany. And this is basically Germany's domestic intelligence agency. And you can see there's a noticeable drop from the 1990s until about the 2010s. However, over the last 5 years or so, we've seen a marked increase in the number of those belonging to far-right groups. So it's increased about 40% from 2014 to 2022. So that's something to watch going forward. And here you can see data showing manifestly anti-Semitic attitudes in Germany. And this is data that's taken every other year by Leipzig University. And basically how they take this is that they conduct a survey and ask respondents 3 questions if they agree with certain statements. And one of them is, do you believe that Jews use nefarious means to trick society? Do you believe that Jews have too much influence? And if a respondent answers yes to all 3 questions, they're deemed manifestly anti-Semitic. So that's what these numbers are showing. And you can see that these numbers have actually dropped from 2002 to 2022 from about 9.5% down to just over 3%. I think it's also worth noting here that in West Germany, the numbers are actually higher than in the former East for most years, which is strange given that the former East is really where there's a hotbed for far-right parties. But I think the next graph helps to explain that, in that levels of xenophobia tend to be much higher in the former East. But I would say that anti-Semitism and xenophobia are often linked because, as I mentioned, over 90% of German Jews have an immigrant background. So anti-Semitism and xenophobia both impact that group. All right, and now here you can see the number of violent anti-Semitic attacks in Germany from 1991 through 2022. And noticeably, we've reached some new highs over the last few years. They were much lower in the 1990s, and there are a few reasons for this. One of them could be simply that there are more Jews in Germany today, so there are more potential victims of attacks. Also, you could argue that the strategies have not been working to the extent that they had hoped. But nonetheless, these are the numbers, and I think it's worth watching moving forward, these new highs that we've reached in recent years. Similar with anti-Semitic crimes. So this data shows not only those attacks, but also things like property crimes. Again, we've reached some new highs in recent years. We've seen some fluctuations over the years, but noticeably, again, these last few years, we've reached some new highs. All right, now who is committing these acts? So the German government breaks down the ideologies of the perpetrators. So police are required to take down the ideological orientation of those who are committing these acts. So Germany has actually pretty detailed data on crimes of with an anti-Semitic motive. And you can see the vast majority are committed from those from a far-right ideology. So 83% of all anti-Semitic crimes during this period were committed by those from a far-right orientation. We also have this interesting category of foreign ideology, which oftentimes includes Islamist ideologies, and that's something that's also increased in recent years. And this is the data for total anti-Semitic crimes, again, including property crimes. And here we have over 90% committed by those from the far right. So that's where the initiatives tend to be focused, is on these groups, because they're the ones committing the vast majority of the anti-Semitic crimes and attacks. And I think it's worth pointing out that even as attitudes have declined, we've seen that spike in attitudes in recent years. And I think an explanation for that is that while these initiatives, the legal and the public diplomacy measures, have largely been successful in reducing general anti-Semitic attitudes in Germany, they have been less successful in penetrating these groups who are more fervent in their beliefs and willing to commit crimes. So that's where strategies really need to be improved going forward. All right, now for some data on Poland. So you can see here, this is data that shows sympathy and antipathy in Poland toward Jews from 93 until 2022. And you can see that in the early 1990s, antipathy was quite high, with the majority in 1993 expressing antipathy toward Jews. And that declined around 2005 when Poland began to implement its public diplomacy measures. So 2008 was the first year where we actually saw more sympathy than antipathy toward Jews. It's leveled off in recent years, and the numbers still are by no means great, but it has been an improvement from where they were in the 1990s. And this is data showing some of these anti-Semitic myths. So this applies specifically to religious anti-Semitism. And respondents are asked the question of whether or not they believe that Jews are responsible for the death of Christ. And we've seen an uptick in this in the years that were measured from the University of Warsaw. So they took surveys in 2009, 2013, and 2017, and we see that that increased from 13% in 2009 to 18% in 2013 to 24% in 2017. We've seen similar data with regard to deicide, that belief within the country, and that's actually increased to a disturbing level. So from 2009, we had 10% agreeing with the statement that Jews use Christian blood in religion and ritual purposes. In 2013, that was 13%. In 2017, it was 25%, which is quite disturbing. And here we measure economically anti-Semitic attitudes. So a question is asked of respondents whether or not they believe that Jews have too much economic influence. The percentage who agrees, actually since 2009, has been a majority. So this is another area, another anti-Semitic myth or manifestation that has not been countered effectively. So we've seen general anti-Semitic attitudes decline in terms of sympathy and antipathy, but in terms of these anti-Semitic myths, they've been less targeted and less successful in countering these sorts of beliefs. Now, in terms of the hate crime reporting in Poland, it's not as detailed as in the German case. And part of this is because in 2016, the Law and Justice government dissolved what was known as the Human Rights Protection Team, which was tasked with collecting data on anti-Semitism and hate crimes within the country. And they repurposed those resources toward European migration. However, since that time, there's been some improvements made to police coordination and reporting on these statistics. So we still have some data on anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic crimes within the country. The Law and Justice government has also threatened the funding for research institutes on anti-Semitism, such as the Center for Research on Prejudice, which I just showed some data from at the University of Warsaw, because they've deemed these organizations biased and anti-Polish. So that's something to watch going forward. The funding is not as threatened right now because Law and Justice is now out of power, but that is something to watch in the future. Now, the crime data for Poland is all quite recent and it's not very well collected. So this data comes from the European Union, and it's basically crime data that's collected from a multitude of organizations. So it's not as consistent. And because of that, I don't find it as reliable, but it's really the only data that we have during this time period. But you can see it's fluctuated a bit, and I don't think we can glean too much from it. Similar story with the crimes that are reported by Polish police. So in recent years, Polish police are now required to take down if a crime is committed with an anti-Semitic motive. So they're required to report that. Again, we've seen fluctuations here in recent years. It's a pretty small sample size, so we can't glean too much from this data. Nonetheless, this is the data that we have to date. All right. Finally, I want to leave you with some survey results from the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency, which surveyed Jews around Europe and their perceptions and experiences. So this data shows anti-Semitic harassment reported by Jews within Europe within the last 5 years and the last 12 months. You can see that Germany actually shows the highest number responding that they have experienced some anti-Semitic harassment, with over 50%, over 40% within the previous year. Poland is similar, and it's still quite high for each of these countries that was measured. So anti-Semitism remains a problem across Europe. This data is from 2018. There should be data released in the next year or so from the 2013 survey, but this is the most recent data that we have to date. And then they also asked the question of where these anti-Semitic comments were made. And by the largest percentage by far was on the internet. So 80% reported experiencing some sort of anti-Semitic comments on the internet. And this is a tricky issue because the internet is a very difficult area to respond to anti-Semitism, whereas you may have these laws and public diplomacy initiatives within these countries. It's very difficult to respond to those online because whereas Nazi expression may be banned within the country and at rallies and so forth, it's nearly impossible to do that on the internet because you can create a domain in the US or Denmark or wherever else where the speech is not banned, and it can be accessed in those countries. So I think that's something to watch for moving forward. And in terms of combating online anti-Semitism, some German states have put forward strategies for this, but it's only been within the last year or two. So these are really in their infancy, and we haven't seen them enacted to this point. All right, I do want to leave you with some good news about the Jewish revival in each of these countries. So in Germany, the Jewish revival is largely characterized by increases in population. So as I mentioned, from 1990, we had about 30,000 German Jews. Now it's about 100,000, still far less than the 500,000 prior to the Holocaust, but these communities have been rebuilding. In some estimates, I took one from 2018, which estimated over 200,000 people in Germany that have a Jewish background. So that this 100,000 and 200,000 numbers are a bit different. So the 100,000 are people who belong to Jewish communities, so who belong to a congregation, whereas the 200,000 number are simply those who have a Jewish background. So they may have a Jewish grandparent, for instance. And then in terms of the Jewish revival in Poland, we've seen this revival characterized by expressions of Jewish culture. So there are events like the Krakow Jewish Culture Festival. We've seen the establishment of the Poland Museum, or the Museum of the History of Jews in Poland. And here's just a photo of the Krakow Jewish Culture Festival, which is attended by an estimated 30,000 people each year. It's broadcast on national television. The Polish president is the honorary chair. So it's a big deal within the country. And by having over 30,000 people attend, there are only fewer than 10,000 Jews in Poland. So there are a lot of non-Jews who are taking an interest in Jewish history and culture within the country. All right, so some final points just to sum up. So as I mentioned, the strategies that we've seen have largely been effective in reducing general anti-Semitic attitudes in each country. In Germany, anti-Semitic attitudes have decreased, but xenophobia is something that remains a concern, and especially for the Jewish community, 90% of whom have an immigrant background. And then in Poland, we've seen general anti-Semitic attitudes decline, but not the belief in certain anti-Semitic myths like deicide and blood libel. Anti-Semitic crime is something that we've seen less affected. So in both cases, the data has fluctuated from year to year. There hasn't been a consistent trend, although particularly in Germany, we've seen an uptick over the last 5 years or so. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, we've seen these indications of a Jewish revival in each country. So in Germany, this is largely defined through population and the increases in the Jewish community. However, in Poland, this has really been through expressions of Jewish culture that have increased, like the different cultural festivals and establishment of museums and Jewish community centers and so forth. All right, so thank you very much for listening to the presentation part of the session, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Tom. That was fantastic. Fantastic piece of scholarship. A lot of really good details, and some good background in history too that I was unaware of. So I appreciate that. And there's a question in the question and answer block I want to get to, and actually it raises a good point because of the strategies that you discussed, none of them really dealt with education. So here, one of our audience members, a distinguished faculty member, as it turns out. To what extent has Holocaust education in German and Austrian schools over the past 20 years helped counter anti-Semitism and promoted tolerance? Same question about Holocaust education in Polish schools. Governments of all three countries participate in the guidelines of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which has guidelines for teaching the Holocaust. How can Holocaust education be more effective? Was it part of your study at all, or did you see aspects of it? And then is it or can it be more effective?
Yeah, I think one thing is training teachers and talking about the Holocaust for one thing, which the Martin Springer Institute, which I previously did a postdoc for, they focus on that. So they will educate teachers on how to teach the Holocaust properly, because it's not simply enough just to teach the Holocaust in schools. The teachers actually have to know what they're talking about, right? So I think that's an area that's important. Also, teaching it a bit earlier. So in many schools, the Holocaust isn't taught until high school or, years when students are teenagers, 16, 17, and that's often the case in these countries as well. German students, and I believe Polish students as well, are required to visit a concentration camp during their studies. So that's something to acknowledge, the past in these countries and reconcile with some of that. But I think there's a lot more, obviously, that can be done in terms of educating the public. There have been some other initiatives to do things like correct mischaracterizations in textbooks. So one of the things they noticed in Poland was there oftentimes were not uh, they were not accurate in describing the uprisings against the Nazi regime. So, for instance, they would combine the 1943 Jewish ghetto uprising with the Warsaw uprising in 1944, and there was just a lot of inaccuracies inside of textbooks. So there's been initiatives to clean those up as well. So that against Polish camps thing that I mentioned, that was one of the parts of that initiative.
Nice. Okay. The next question in the Q&A block from one of our members actually goes along with something else I noted as you were talking about this rightward ideological movement kind of is prevalent across the globe, and so not just in Poland and Germany, right? The political mobilization space has really been globalized in a lot of ways, and we see that kind of going across borders. But the question from the audience is, how can we use kind of what you've been talking about, which is, all right, take what we know, use this information to defy the pernicious wave of fascism in the United States?
I think one of the things that's important is countering conspiracy theories, because most conspiracy theories tend to eventually lead back toward anti-Semitism, in this belief of a small cabal of people, and that oftentimes leads back toward Jews. So we've seen the rise of, the QAnon conspiracy theories in the US and elsewhere. Those are actually quite prevalent in Germany as well. And these are basically just recycling aspects of old anti-Semitism into new conspiracy theories. And I think that's one of the things that leads toward this resentment. And you see the language change in some ways. So, for instance, you'll oftentimes see the word globalist used, and oftentimes that's a word used to describe Jews as well. So the term dates back quite far into history about global Jewish financiers. So the term globalist today is often used to describe Jews without saying that word.
Right.
So I think that the language is important, and also dispelling some of these conspiracy theories that have been quite rampant, especially on the internet, which is an area where I think a lot of the rise of anti-Semitism in recent years is can be traced back to social media and the internet.
Yeah.
Because these things can spread like wildfire, things can go viral, and there's really not a concerted effort to counter them. And I think that there are some measures that can be taken. And I don't think it's necessarily banning things online that is effective, because as we've seen in these countries, there's certain anti-Semitic rhetoric that is banned, but it's impossible to police that online. So I think a better approach might be efforts to counter that specifically, and not necessarily just from governments, but NGOs as well. There are things like what's called political jamming. So having counter narratives online. So there are organizations that will go into some of these dark chat rooms and put in counter narratives as well that people may not be exposed to, and use satire and the same tactics that are used by these extremist groups, and use them against them to counter those narratives.
Yeah, the information space really does complicate this whole process. Like I said, it's a globalized thing now, like you mentioned, and so it's really difficult to track down the source of all these of the conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories themselves are probably pretty hard to counter, though, aren't they? I mean, in a lot of cases, those of us listening to a conspiracy theory are just going to chuckle and go, "Nobody can possibly believe that," but there are. And so, do we have? I mean, have you seen any really effective strategies besides a couple that you mentioned just now? Are there other effective strategies for basically reducing the salience of conspiracy theories?
I think conspiracy theories are always going to be with us because one of the things that's consistent about them is their inconsistency. So anytime that something is dispelled, they'll find an explanation for it. So I think it's just a constant game of trying to knock these down over time and just trying to penetrate enough of the population where they are marginalized to those low percentages. I mentioned, Poland and Germany, they have 5% thresholds for their parliament. So trying to keep those extremist movements on the outskirts and not let them penetrate into the mainstream, which they have in recent years in a number of countries. And I think that's, another thing that accounts for the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attitudes in recent years in different parts of the world is the rise of nationalism as well. And I think it's important to differentiate between patriotism and nationalism because people oftentimes get those terms confused. Whereas patriotism is doing good for one's country, nationalism is doing things at the exclusion of others. So I think that's why nationalism and anti-Semitism are often intertwined, is because, especially in these countries and with their history, that exclusion is of Jews. So I think that those things are all important to take into account as well.
Yeah. The information space is so polluted now, it's just really difficult to kind of think through how you would deal all that. But so I'm gonna we have about 10 minutes left, 9 minutes left or so in the hour. And so feel free to ask a question, anybody in the audience. If you got something, type in the Q&A block and I'll get it answered for you. But I'm going to ask you to do the impossible. Actually, I'm going to ask you to disaggregate some of at least, and I know you can't probably do this in some sort of purely academic or scientific way, but can you disaggregate the efforts that were made and the strategies that you outlined with regards to their effectiveness? Where did you, if you were to rank those strategies, the legal ones and the public diplomacy ones, how would you have ranked them in efficacy?
I would say the public diplomacy initiatives have been more successful than legal measures, um, particularly in terms of, so as I said, in terms of decreasing general anti-Semitic attitudes, that's where they've been most effective. But I don't think the focus yet has really shifted enough toward targeting those most adamant anti-Semites and extremists. So there has been a real struggle in trying to penetrate those groups, and that's where I think the emphasis needs to be going forward. So, we can try to counteract all these conspiracy theories and so forth, but it's very difficult to also detect those who have been radicalized. As we've seen in the US, I mentioned a few mass shootings that took place from an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and these people were largely unknown. They weren't people who belonged to far-right groups. They weren't people who were at these marches. So I think that's something to watch for moving forward too. And I think that's one of the reasons why there needs to be more of a concerted effort in some of these, dark areas of the web where there's only maybe 50, 60 people who belong to them, and they're just communicating with each other and nobody else can penetrate that bubble, and they radicalize each other, and it just becomes a real hotbed of extremism. So I think there needs to be more of an effort in detecting where those people are and how we can counter those narratives.
Sorry about the dog. Uh, bound to happen, I suppose. So there's an interesting point you made about the kind of the darker places in the web, right? Because a lot of talk today about policing hate speech and that sort of stuff, and policing just policing the general, especially social media sites, and the kind of responsibility falling on some of the companies that host those. But a lot of times the lone wolves or the kind of violent actors aren't operating in that space anyway. They're acting somewhere else. And so do you see that space being then kind of policed, if you will, by NGOs or by state governments or by who? Is that what makes sense there, do you think?
I think it can be both. I don't think it has to be exclusive to either one because to this point, there hasn't really been much of an emphasis from either in those areas. Um, and in Germany, they've seen the consequences of this as well. There was a man back in 2019 who opened fire on a synagogue in the city of Halle, who actually didn't end up killing anybody inside because of the security measures in place, but he went to some nearby shops and killed a few others who he thought were immigrants. So I think there's such a difficulty in penetrating those areas, and there really has to be more of a concerted effort in trying to do so. And I think law enforcement certainly can be a part of that, but NGOs as well. Rather than just focusing on the general population, which is important, I think it's important to really try to penetrate those elements that commit these crimes within these countries and elsewhere.
Great. Our audience doesn't seem to have much in the way of questions. I'll give them another minute or two to finish typing if they're typing one right now. But otherwise, any final thoughts or ideas about where we're headed with efforts to combat, anti-Semitism and other forms of this kind of violence against groups?
I think really the next phase is examining how some of these national strategies and state level strategies are being implemented. So at this point, they're quite broad in terms of their aims. So there's typically like 4 or 5 pillars of these strategies, and watching how those are implemented over time and what sort of effect that those have going forward too. And we have one adopted here in the US as well. Again, it's quite broad. And I think there has been less of a motivation in the US to combat anti-Semitism than in these two countries since the Cold War, because the US, we often see ourselves as the heroes of World War II, and we were the ones who, put a stop to Nazi Germany. But anti-Semitism, as I mentioned, it's a major problem here in the US as well. We've seen anti-Semitic incidents, I believe, just over the last year that was measured. So from 2021 to 2022, there was about a 30% increase in anti-Semitic incidents. So it's a major problem in the US. And I think, we don't have good data over the last few months with the new Gaza war that just started at the end of last year. But I think that's something to keep in mind going forward and see how
Right.
that develops.
You kind of
I didn't even see the question.
question
Now.
to Q&A block is it's a good question, and there's going to be a play there. There is definitely some factor there, and I know you're watching the whole situation, all this stuff closely. This is what you do as a professional, as an academic and scholar in this field. So you're going to keep an eye on that. But I'm going to put you on the spot because I know we conversed about this before the seminar started, but I want to know where your research goes next based upon the fact that this book is published, it's out now, and it's a really good launching point for a lot of interesting work. Do you have any sense of where you might be going from here in your research?
So I do want to research how strategies have been implemented in the United States in recent years, and whether they have, to much of an extent, because it seems like they've been less coordinated than they were in these countries, where there was more of a concerted effort by different agencies in the government, different NGOs focused on them. Here we have the AJC, the ADL, some organizations that have been doing this type of work. But I also want to look at some of the more recent conspiracy theories as well and see how these manifestations of anti-Semitism relate to them. So I mentioned QAnon and those types of conspiracy theories as well, and see how those draw from these different manifestations of anti-Semitism and how they're leading toward extremism today. So that great replacement theory is another one that's been quite prevalent, and actually probably in the last few years has motivated more terrorist attacks in the US and deaths than any other.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, I thank you very much for taking time to to share your work with us. I think your book's going to be a big hit. I appreciate the effort. I appreciate the effort you put into your teaching as well in our MA in Global Security. The students love you. Your material is important, and we're happy for you, and we're glad you're part of our team. And we'll do this again when you have more to report. All right. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate taking the time to be with us this evening, and we hope to see you again in the future. We've got a couple more events like this coming up, so keep your eyes open for emails coming out, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all.
Thank you.